It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Amy Goodman to our community. Others will speak about Amy's many accomplishments, but I just want to acknowledge, for those of us here in Brooklyn and around the country who work on issues of peace and social justice, that Amy Goodman's independent, intelligent, creative journalism has been an indispensable resource which makes our activism possible. As we come together to honor Amy, we also reaffirm for ourselves the importance of our work. And the challenges are very great. An undissolved militarism at the core of our society, which poisons our domestic and international policy in more ways than we can count. Now, David, in his cheerful way, listed all the wars that we're in. And when you listen to David's list, oh, that's a lot of wars. But the thing is that these are wars in the shadows. We're talking about special ops in 120 countries. We're talking about somewhere, and you can correct me, between 5,000 and 6,000 American bombs dropped in Syria and Iraq. But for the most part, these things are happening without large numbers of American troops on the ground. It makes it really invisible. And that's a big challenge for us. How do you organize against wars everywhere, which, other than journalists like Amy and other independent voices, these aren't being covered, and for most people, these wars aren't even happening?
I hope you realize we're attending the merger of Cox Broadcasting and Comcast tonight. Democracy Now!, the left's equivalent of Cox Broadcasting, and Brooklyn for Peace, the equivalent of Comcast, with our once-a-month show on Brooklyn Public Television on the second Wednesday. So we urge all of you to join these two media behemoths in making sure that the world is safe for democracy. Actually, the world is getting safer for the War and Peace report that Amy does every day. There are now over 1,400 public stations around the world that are broadcasting Democracy Now! About a decade ago, we did a campaign in Brooklyn for Peace to get them on Brooklyn cable TV. Now they've graduated to CUNY TV. They're really, growing by leaps and bounds, which is it's really terrific. And it's obviously vitally important, given the hidden nature, as Rusty explained, of American militarism and our poisoned foreign policy at this point. I am holding, for Amy's benefit, a proclamation from Congressmember Yvette Clarke. You all have been very good tonight, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But I will read one paragraph, which is, whereas the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman, has provided an invaluable contribution to the debate about public policy and has inspired a generation of listeners and viewers who believe in our capacity to improve the world. And that means we need you in Brooklyn for Peace, really, 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 as Rusty said. We want to give Amy our Pathmaker for Peace Award tonight for her courage, for her dedication to the causes that we all believe in, and for being the single media person who has really led the way in making sure that the variety of news of the world is conveyed to us in a way that is intelligent, intelligible, and is unbiased, at least as compared to, say, the New York Times, without fear or favor. So with that, let me bring up Amy Goodman.
Wow, what an honor it is to be here with all of you tonight. Brooklyn for peace. It is so much harder to wage peace than it is to wage war. And we have to change that. Movements are what make all of the difference. And how important it is, as we broadcast Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report every day, to take on war. The backdrop of everything that is happening, these endless wars that are being waged. No one disputes that the United States military attacked a hospital in the city of Kunduz, Afghanistan, in the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, October 3rd. The airstrike on Doctors Without Borders facility, the Kunduz Trauma Center, was devastating, with at least 30 people killed. They haven't been able to identify all of the remains, so they're not sure of the number. Patients in the only intensive care unit in the region were burned to death in their beds. Medical staffers were killed by shrapnel bombs that tore off their limbs. At least one person was decapitated. Are we talking about ISIS? Are we talking about the Taliban? No. As the people fled the burning building, the U.S. AC-130 gunship slaughtered them from above with automatic fire. Doctors and other medical staff were shot while running to reach safety in a different part of the compound. The Kunduz Trauma Center had been in the same place performing thousands of surgeries and treating tens of thousands of people in the emergency room for 4 years. Doctors Without Borders, known internationally by its French name, Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, had repeatedly provided the exact GPS coordinates of the hospital complex to U.S. and Afghan government officials. We had Jason Cohn on Democracy Now!, the executive director of Doctors Without Borders USA. He said, as a precondition of opening the hospital, we negotiated with the U.S., with Afghan, with NATO, and opposition forces, with the Taliban. We received the support of all of those groups to operate in the hospital, he said. Part of that was sharing our GPS coordinates with the various parties. We shared them as recently as September 29th. This was October 3rd. When I asked Jason Cohn, as he sat at Democracy Now!, if this constituted a war crime, he employed the precise language of the humanitarian aid worker. He said, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not this was a mistake. This is not necessarily the threshold that has to be crossed for this to constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian law. If the military fails to distinguish between military and civilian targets, as is in this case, from our standpoint, from everything we know, then they are guilty, he said. MSF is demanding an independent investigation, and that demand is being supported by now well over 500,000 signatures. Not the U.S. alone to investigate, not NATO, not the Afghan government, but a truly independent investigation. 3 weeks after the attack in Kunduz, another MSF hospital was struck, this time in Yemen. The hospital was hit multiple times over a 2-year period last week, even though the roof was marked with the MSF logo and its GPS coordinates have been shared multiple times with the Saudi-led coalition forces. Every indication is that the Saudi Arabian military, using U.S.-provided bombers and arms, launched the strike. The horror of the Kunduz hospital attack will never leave MSF nurse Lahla Sultan Jeks. She was sleeping in the hospital safe room when the bombs hit. It was like 2, 3 in the morning. She said, we tried to take a look into one of the burned buildings. I cannot describe what was inside. There are no words for how terrible it was. It was in the intensive care unit, 6 patients burning in their beds. We saw our colleagues dying, our pharmacist. I was just talking to him last night and planning the stocks, and then he died there in our office, she said. Neither hospital attack has been mentioned in any of the US presidential debates or forums so far. We need a full investigation of these crimes to hold those responsible accountable, and we need a full debate in this presidential year to determine whether attacks like these that only perpetuate terror will be allowed to continue. But East Timor. In 1975, President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger went to Indonesia, met with a long-reigning dictator who had presided over the killing of perhaps more than 1 million of his own people within the last years. But in 1965 to 67 and 75, Kissinger and Ford met with Suharto and gave him the go-ahead for Indonesia to invade this tiny island country, East Timor, about 300 miles above Australia. As the President and Secretary of State flew out to then go meet with Marcos in the Philippines, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor by land, by air, and by sea. And they closed East Timor to the outside world, starting on December 7th, 1975. And they commenced one of the great slaughters of the 20th century. I got a chance to go to Timor in 1990 and 91 with my colleague, an incredibly brave journalist named Alan Nairn. He was writing for The New Yorker, I was doing a documentary for Pacifica, and we went after 17 years of this occupation. We heard that 1/3 of the population had been killed. We found there a hell on earth. Everywhere we went, the military was surveilling the people, taking the people, ripping them out of their homes. It was truly terrifying. And we went in 1990 and then back in 1991. It was the end of October, and the reason we went then, this was 24 years ago, was because we heard for the first time ever the UN had brokered a deal with Indonesia that they could send in a delegation to investigate the human rights situation. We wanted to go to see how the Timorese were going to be able to talk to this UN delegation. When we got there, we went to the main church in Dili, the capital of Timor. The women were crying in the mass. We didn't know if it was the standard sorrow of this occupied country or if something terrible had just happened. We learned after the mass that the Indonesian military had surrounded the church the night before and shot into it and killed a young man who had taken refuge in the church. So many young people had taken refuge in the churches of East Timor to prepare to speak to the delegation. They didn't want to be arrested, and the church, the Catholic Church, was the only place that they could take refuge. They left their workplaces, their homes, and they were all hiding out in these churches, and the military had come to the main church and shot into it and killed this young man named Sebastião Gomez. The next day, there was a funeral for him. 1,000 people came out. And they went to the cemetery following the procession, the funeral procession, and we'd never seen anything like it. The Indonesian, the people of East Timor put up their hands in the V sign and they shouted, "Viva East Timor, Viva Independence, Viva Sebastião," not that they knew him. And in this unprecedented act of defiance, they buried Sebastião. Well, we were waiting for the UN delegation. And in this 2-week period, we learned that the UN would not be coming. The delegation was not coming. We later learned it was at the behest of the United States. So then came November 12th, 1991. And the young people decided they wanted to march once again on the 2-week anniversary of Sebastião's death to the cemetery to retrace their steps. It was early in the morning. We went to the church where the Mass was held. The priests, so many people in the church, they had to hold the communion outside, and now thousands came. And after Mass, they went out into the street, and this time they unfurled banners from their Catholic school uniforms. They would rip out bed sheets they had hidden, and you'd see a young woman with her traditional, an older woman in her traditional Timorese garb holding up one end of a sign, and a girl in her Catholic school uniform holding out the other. And they marched through the streets of Dili, through this geography of pain, where every other building they passed, perhaps it was a military barracks where prisoners were killed, or in the back of a hotel where Timorese were held, or officers' homes where Timorese women were raped. They knew this place so well. It was their home, but it was occupied. And they marched through the streets of Dili, and they made their way to the cemetery, the same place where Sebastião was buried. Thousands of people marched, and we followed them. And at the cemetery, we asked them, it was about 8 in the morning, why are you doing this? The Indonesian military had lined the route. They were risking so much. And the people said, for my mother, or for my father, for my village, it was wiped out. And then from the direction the procession had come, we saw hundreds of Indonesian soldiers marching down the dirt road, holding their US M16s at the ready position. We were in the middle of the crowd interviewing people. Alan suggested we walk to the front because although we knew they had committed many massacres in the past, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists. And so we thought if we made clear who we were, we always hid who we were because we didn't want to endanger any person speaking to a Western journalist. But now we thought, we took out our equipment, I put my headphones on, I held up my microphone like a flag, Alan put the camera above his head, and we walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up 10 to 12 abreast. The people were trapped because there were high walls on either side of the road. People at the back could run away. Some could run through a tiny wall in the cemetery. And the soldiers marched up. It was very quiet. Behind us, the people stood. We saw the soldiers marching up. I had my microphone out like a flag, and the soldiers swept around the corner, and without any warning, without any hesitation, without any provocation, they swept past us and they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. The first to go down was a little boy behind us. He just exploded from the gunfire, and the soldiers kept shooting. A group of them came at me, and they took my microphone, waving it in my face as if to say, this is what we don't want. And they slammed me to the ground. Alan took a photograph of the soldiers opening fire, and he threw himself on top of me to protect me. But then they took their US M16s like baseball bats and slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. So we were laying on the ground. Alan was covered in blood. They were killing everyone around us. And they lined up in firing squad fashion, a group of them that weren't killing the others, and they put the guns to our heads. They'd stripped us now of everything. And the only thing I had left was my passport. And they were shouting, Australia, Australia, and they were shouting politique, politique, as if to say we were political if we were doing this, and were we from Australia? So I threw my passport at them. You know, we were from America, and we said, no, America, America. They'd kick me in the stomach, I'd get my breath back, America, America. More joined in this firing squad line. But ultimately, they took the guns from our hands. We believe because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They would have to pay a price for killing us that they had never had to pay for killing the Timorese. And they moved on. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up, and the driver got out, and they had beaten an old Timorese man into a ditch, and every time he picked up his hand in prayer, they took the butts of their rifles and they smashed his face. And they had moved on to kill others, and the Red Cross driver picked him up and put him in the Jeep. We climbed into the Jeep. Scores of Timorese jumped on top of us, on top of the vehicle, and we drove away from this killing field to the hospital, where the doctors and nurses were furiously working on people to save them, those who had not died right there being shot. Incredibly brave young people who could have run. But when one of their friends or sisters or brothers had fallen, they would stop and hold them so they wouldn't die alone. And then they would be shot. And so these were the people in this hospital. But when the doctors and nurses saw us, they started to cry. And I think not because we were in worse shape than the Timorese, we weren't. But what we represent to people, not me and Alan, I'm talking about all of us as Americans, as Westerners, and not just to people in Timor, but all over the world. They see us in two ways, as the sword and the shield. The sword because the US provides weapons to human rights abusing regimes like the Indonesian government. But they also see the people in a different way than their government. And they see the people of the United States as their shield. And that day they saw their shield bloodied, and I think it just deepened their despair. We went into hiding then. We knew we had to leave the hospital. The military would raid it very soon. This is where the survivors were. We got to the bishop's house, Bishop Bello, Bishop Carlos Jimenez Bello, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize with José Ramos Horta, who would become president. But we went to his house, and thousands were taking refuge at the bishop's house. We knew the only way, we certainly had not succeeded in stopping the killing. The Indonesian military killed 270 people on that day. And this was not one of the larger massacres in Timor. But we knew the only way we could stop the killing is if we got word to the outside world. There was one plane getting out that day. The bishop helped me clean up Alan. He gave him his shirt. Alan's head was just glistening with blood under his hair. But if we could clean it up fast enough and get to the airport, maybe we could get out on the plane without the military noticing. The city was now shut down. We raced to the airport, and at the airport, the security run by the military started to shout and deal with us. And we didn't know if they didn't realize we were at the massacre site or they had officially decided not to kill us, and now they wanted us out. But we did get out of the country. Got on that plane, made our way to West Timor, which is part of Indonesia, and on to Bali, where we could make the phone call to the West. And as Alan made that call, I took the towel. We couldn't go back to get any of our things, but I had taken his bloody shirt and wrapped it under a towel around my skirt, because I thought, I knew the military would deny anything had taken place, but how could they explain what happened to us? And someone had taken 18 pictures of us just so that we could show that when we got out, and I hid that. And when we got to Bali, we made the call. Alan called, and I was wiping the phone, the blood off of the phone as he spoke, and he said, there's been this massacre. We flew on to Guam. In Guam, we went to the cable network station that linked up with CNN, showed the photographs, explained what happened. The Indonesian military denied anything had happened, as they so often had. This was November 12th, 1991. We got back to the United States as Alan was operated on in Guam and in Washington, D.C. We then held a news conference at the National Press Club to ensure that people understood that what allowed the Indonesian military to do that was our weapons. From the beginning in 1975, the Indonesian military was armed, trained, and financed by the United States right through the 17-year period until 1991. It was the first time the networks mentioned East Timor in all of this time. Even though the genocide in Timor was worse proportionally than Cambodia, but the difference was Pol Pot was an official enemy of the United States, so all the media would talk about it as they should. But in the case of Indonesia, Indonesia was a friend of Democratic and Republican presidents alike, from Ford to Reagan to Bush, from Ford to Carter to Reagan to Bush to Clinton, making deals with Suharto. That was 1991. 8 years later, the people of East Timor got to vote for their freedom. In 1999, in a UN-sponsored resolution. And now I'll come to the end. For 3 years, the United Nations ran East Timor. As it transitioned, they voted for their freedom in 1999. And May 20th, 2002, the people of East Timor became the newest nation in the world. We were able to get back into Timor for this celebration of independence. 100,000 people gathered outside of Dili in a place called Tasitolo, the surviving Timorese. Then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave a speech, world dignitaries gave speeches, and then Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of Timor, had been imprisoned by the Indonesians for years. The founding president got up, and he spoke in so many languages it would put us all to shame. And he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. And there was this fireworks display, and you could see the light reflected in the tear-stained faces of the people of Timor. They had resisted, and they had won. At an unbelievably, unacceptably high price, but they had won. A third of their population killed, 200,000 people. This nation of survivors had prevailed. And as they celebrated their victory, they thanked people, especially from the most powerful countries, for telling their governments to stop supplying weapons to the human rights abusing regimes of the world. And they have always been a lesson to us as a model of how to resist and to prevail. Whether we are doctors or nurses, professors, whether we're librarians, journalists, students, whether we're artists, employed or unemployed, we have a decision to make every day, every hour of every day. And that is whether we want to represent the sword or the shield. Democracy Now!